So today I'm going to give you an introduction to one of the classics of the gangster film genre and one of my favorite movies from the early 1930s, The Public Enemy from 1931. The gangster genre is one of the most popular, enduring, and controversial genres of classic Hollywood, even through current times, right? It's extremely popular and controversial. Pre-code Hollywood, right? So this era of Hollywood between kind of 1929 and 1934, where there were lots of sort of racy, sexy, violent films that weren't very regulated. The pre-code era produced what are considered the three foundational films of this genre. Little Caesar in 1930, The Public Enemy in 1931, and Scarface in 1932. Actually, this latter movie, Scarface, is famously remade and updated by director Brian De Palma in 1983, starring Al Pacino. And there's lots and lots and lots of other gangster movies in the 30s. And A movies, B movies. This is an incredibly popular genre throughout the entire decade. So why is this genre so popular in the 30s? And also kind of what's the context in which viewers in the 30s are watching gangster movies. So the most important historical context to think about when watching a gangster film like The Public Enemy is Prohibition, which was a nationwide constitutional ban, the 18th Amendment, on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages from 1920 to 1933. So a lot of people are actually at the time supporting this because alcoholism is actually a serious social problem in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. And it isn't just kind of conservative moral opposition to use of alcohol, but actually kind of in the early 20th century, it's seen as a progressive issue and supported by a lot of women's organizations. The women's suffrage movement is also sort of a prohibition movement also. And that's because, there was a lot of women who were married and their husbands got drunk, beat them up, and spent all of their money at the bar. So it's kind of seen as this both conservative but also kind of progressive social issue. So in 1920, the 18th Amendment comes into effect. Although, as many of us probably know, prohibition laws are disregarded pretty widely in a lot of places, and they're often really hard to enforce federally. Kansas City itself was known as the wide open town during Prohibition, and the alcohol flowed freely. Think about our conceptions of the roaring 20s, the jazz age, all of this partying. Alcohol is a central part of it. And this is in the middle of Prohibition, where technically you're not supposed to be able to drink. So, how do people get alcohol during Prohibition? So organized criminal gangs took control of the alcohol supply for many cities and localities. And this unleashed a crime wave, especially in big cities like New York and Chicago, that was very unprecedented for the time and also very shocking for a lot of people. So by the late 1920s, there is a significant backlash against prohibition that is mobilizing nationwide, both because of people wanting to drink, but also because of these criminal repercussions. State and local governments are losing a lot of revenue from the taxes on alcohol. And this is especially important when the Great Depression hits in 1929 and state and local governments are losing lots of revenue because of the economic crisis. And, crime rates, as I mentioned, have increased in cities because of organized crime's involvement in illegal alcohol distribution and sales. In a study of more than 30 major U.S. cities during the Prohibition years of 1920 to 1931, the number of violent crimes increased by 24%, and often sort of affiliated with alcohol, the production and distribution of alcohol. So people wanted both to drink again, but they also wanted this criminality to decline. So Prohibition ends with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment. And it goes into effect December 5th, 1933. Some states continued statewide alcohol prohibition for many decades afterwards, like Kansas. And even though there's this kind of perception that prohibition failed, the fact that alcohol did kind of flow more freely than the federal government would have liked, and it was hard to enforce. It did actually succeed in cutting alcohol consumption in half during the 1920s, and consumption remained below pre-prohibition levels until the 1940s, although a lot of that probably has to do with, people not having in the 30s as much money to spend on extra goods like alcohol. So I mentioned organized crime played a really big part in Prohibition, and organized crime is really what the gangster genre is about. So what is organized crime? What does that actually mean? So the FBI definition of organized crime is a, quote, self-perpetuating association of individuals who operate wholly or in part by illegal means and irrespective of geography. They constantly seek to attain power, influence, and monetary gain. And the group's primary goal is economic gain, and they will employ an array of lawful and illicit schemes to generate profit. So this is really about amassing economic power. So part of organized crime, when we hear the word organized crime, we often think of like the mafia. So what exactly is the mafia, and how is it related to organized crime? So the word the mafia originally is used in the U.S. context to refer to organized crime groups primarily comprised of individuals of Italian-American descent, right? So think of The Godfather. But the term actually, can be used more broadly now. When we hear about, the Japanese mafia or the Albanian mafia, or, it kind of it's sort of taken out of this ethnic context. So, there is kind of this ethnic association with how we imagine organized crime in the United States, and definitely in the minds of audiences in the 1930s. Organized crime and the mafia and bootlegging and, distribution and sales of illegal alcohol is very much associated ethnically with Italian Americans and Irish Americans. So in the US, while organized crime and mafia groups exist before Prohibition, they gained significant power during that era. So these organized crimes groups really kind of limited their activities to prostitution and gambling and theft until 1920. But with Prohibition, there's this huge opportunity. Bootlegging is extremely profitable when alcohol is federally illegal, and there's this huge black market for alcohol. Now, in modern times, of course, when we think of organized crime, we associate them with drug trafficking, migrant labor, migrant smuggling, human trafficking, money laundering, firearms trafficking, illegal gambling, extortion, counterfeit goods, even cybercrime. But, kind of the big leap that organized crime makes from kind of, gambling and prostitution is with Prohibition, and they get into bootlegging, and that really sort of gives a huge boost to these organizations. So beyond kind of the context of Prohibition and organized crime, we also have to remember that audiences watching early gangster films are in the middle of the Great Depression. By 1931, 1932, the U.S. economy is just in the dumps. The economy has crashed. Banks are closing left and right. People are losing their jobs. They're feeling vulnerable. Their situation is more precarious. So think about what that context means for people wanting to watch gangster movies. And 1932 is a presidential election year. Herbert Hoover, the sitting president, is seen as not doing enough versus FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's offering a new deal for the American people. And the public, while you're kind of watching these gangster movies, and lots of movies, while you're sitting in the movie theater, you're being bombarded with newspaper headlines, radio news, and newsreel footage. And a lot of that newsreel footage is about famous gangsters like Al Capone or outlaws like John Dillinger. So out of this context of Prohibition, of organized crime, the Great Depression, and sort of this entertainment news emphasis on criminals and gangsters, you get the rise of the gangster genre. As I mentioned, an incredibly popular genre even to this day. So what defines the gangster genre? And sometimes we can say the crime film in general. So the stories in the gangster genre usually follow the rise and fall of a particular individual, a particular gangster, or a member of the organized crime organization, usually sort of starting with their rise from the bottom, often to the very top, and then often kind of a fall from the top. And especially in conflict with other rival gangs or criminal groups. There's often a ripped from the headlines feel. Headline grabbing situations, real life gangsters, or crime reports have often been used in these kinds of films as the basis of these films. Film gangsters are usually materialistic, street smart, immoral, megalomaniacal, and self destructive. And they rise to power with a tough, cruel facade while showing an ambitious desire for success and recognition. But underneath that, they can express sensitivity and gentleness. So actually, that's kind of what's seen as problematic by the moral crusaders in some of these characters. We can talk about this in regards to Public Enemy, that there's kind of a sensitivity under their toughness that makes them appealing. Right? These aren't necessarily being presented as negative characters. These are kind of anti-hero, and we're sympathizing with them and their criminality. And that is problematic for individuals who believe that movies are corrupting the morals of America. So gangster films can actually kind of be strangely viewed as morality tales, that it's kind of this pursuit in some ways of the American dream, right? Of the American dream success, but sort of turned upside down or turned sideways because it's through criminality. But it's often through sort of this innovative an entrepreneurial kind of criminality. So while it's, in some ways sort of it's crime, but it's also sort of pursuing the American dream. And there's always kind of this tension between glorifying and condemning the criminal activities and violent acts of the main characters. So protagonists are often morally conflicted and presented as anti-heroes. And, this can be problematic for some people who want movies to very clearly try to better us. The aesthetics and visual imagery of the gangster film kind of also have some consistent aspects, that they're usually set in large crowded cities. I mean, that's where organized crime often is. Dark nightclubs or streets with lurid neon signs, fast cars, piles of cash, sleazy bars, contraband, seedy living quarters, and rooming houses. And there's also kind of this city talk slang. So the slang that you hear in early 30s gangster film are like hoods and malls and stool pigeon, and kind of this fast talking rapid fire speech and the use of a lot of sarcasm. And then also the gangster style in terms of outfits, and accoutrements, Tommy guns, fedoras, double-breasted suits, coin flipping, right? And there's also kind of these connotations in gangster movies with race, ethnicity, and economic class. And this kind of connects back to what I was talking a little bit in terms of the perception of organized crime and ethnicity. So gangsters often start out as poor and work their way to the top before the fall. They're often from lower classes. Gangster characters often fall prey to crime in pursuit of wealth and status and material possessions, because all of the other, quote, normal avenues in a capitalist society to the top are unavailable to them, often because of their class and or ethnicity. They're often from poor immigrant and or minority families. So the early gangsters, as I mentioned, are often perceived as Italian or Irish or actually Jewish as well in the New York context. Modern gangsters, I mean, we still kind of associate with them with the Italian, but nowadays, you watch a gangster film, it can be about Russians, it can be about Japanese, African Americans, right? There's a lot of African American filmmakers who've sort of taken upon the gangster genre as well. There's also kind of this rural Midwest criminal outlaw, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, sort of the criminal, in rural America, on the run from the law. The modern variant maybe is Breaking Bad, I don't know, cooking meth and rural America gangster, but there's also that kind of variant. The gangster genre was very controversial from the start, accused by some of glorifying crime and violence, especially in the minds of impressionable youth. So here's some quotes from various newspaper articles that were publishing letters that the Warner Brothers studio, who made The Public Enemy and a lot of the other gangster films. So these are letters that the studio received about gangster films that were published in the newspaper. Quote, "Gangster pictures are poisoning the minds of younger generations. Until the gangster screen character is entirely robbed of his glamour, he should be kept out of pictures. Such pictures are more destructive to the morality of our country than any other single force today." And even Al Capone, actual gangster, said, "These gang pictures, that's terrible kid stuff. They're doing nothing but harm the younger element of this country. I don't blame the censors for trying to bar them." Okay, Al Capone. Maybe he didn't want the competition. So, gangster films are often blamed as being one of the primary culprits for the enforcement of the production code in Hollywood in July of 1934. That there's a lot of sort of outcry about this, what seems positive portrayal of criminality. So we're going to be watching The Public Enemy, produced by Warner Brothers, who produced a lot of the 30s gangster films, and directed by William A. Wellman. It stars James Cagney as an Irish-American gangster who rises in the criminal underworld of Prohibition-era Chicago. James Cagney, actually, you might recognize him as one of the most well-known and versatile actors of the 30s and 40s in Hollywood. He was a huge star during these decades, starring in both crime dramas and comedies. Even though he's kind of known for his portrayal of tough guys and gangsters, he actually got his start as a singer and dancer in vaudeville. And sometimes in his acting style, you'll sort of note the way that his body moves is very much like a dancer. His only Academy Award for Best Actor in the film Yankee Doodle Dandy, he actually used his vaudeville singing and dancing skills to great effect, but it was kind of an unusual film for him. The movie also stars Kansas City's own Jean Harlow, as well as Joan Blondell, Edward Woods, and Donald Cook. It should be noted many state and local censor boards made significant cuts to gangster films like The Public Enemy. The Kansas State Censor Board, strangely, did not make any cuts to The Public Enemy and Little Caesar, which was another kind of early gangster film. But kind of the third great early gangster film, Scarface, the Kansas State Censor Board outright banned. So who knows why? So, a few little tidbits about the movie. Real bullets are actually used in some scenes, which was a common practice on set during this time period. One round hit a spot moments after Cagney had been standing there. There's also a scene where Cagney gets hit for real and was not expecting it. I think from sort of stuff that's flying from where the bullets hit. So not from a bullet, but he's kind of hit by debris flying from the bullets hitting a wall. See if you can find it. Also, there's an infamous and controversial grapefruit smooshing scene, which was controversial even at the time. So I'm really curious to see what you guys think about the grapefruit smooshing scene, especially in terms of sort of how James Cagney's character is portrayed and sort of gender dynamics. Anyway, so that is all I have to say about the film. Enjoy the show, and I can't wait to talk to you about it.